Thank you all for coming out here today on this Friday afternoon, doing the responsible thing and cutting class, like I'm sure most of you are. Before we start, I'd like to first thank Senator and Mrs. Paul for taking the time out of their schedule to speak with us today. Really appreciate it. And I'd also like to thank Polis and specifically BJ Rudell for helping make this possible. So everyone give a round of applause for BJ, please. So to introduce our speaker today, I'd like to invite Dr. Richard Salzman to the stage. Dr. Salzman's a professor of political science here at Duke, and he'll do a much better job than I would. So.
That's not possible, Nikhil. I know your skills at interviewing, introducing people. Welcome, Senator and Mrs. Paul. My name is Richard Salzman. I'm a professor in political science in the PP&E program, so we teach a synthesis of philosophy, politics, and economics. The program is headed by Professor Mike Munger. And I want to thank also Polis and YAL for sponsoring this. So it's a really great pleasure and honor for me to introduce not only a Duke alum from the medical school, I won't tell you what year, but also the junior senator from Kentucky in his second term now. Well, Senator, the first part is to make you feel welcomed, and the second part is to make you feel young. So you are the junior senator. Presidential candidate in 2016. I'll leave you just with this, because it's not my time, it's his. Years ago, a very famous British stateswoman spoke of conviction politicians as opposed to unprincipled, opportunistic politicians. The conviction politician actually believes something, has fixed principles, has a compass. And that is Senator Paul. It's a very rare thing in Washington, it's a very rare thing in politics generally, to be a principled politician, but then on top of that, to have principles that relate closely to the U.S. Constitution, to principles of liberty. So you have a unique figure in front of you, both an alum and a very young junior senator. So I give it to you, Senator Paul.
Thank you. I'm doing it. Thank you, Professor Salzman, Nikhil, Yal. Thanks for putting this on. I'm excited to be here. As most of you know, my son is a sophomore here, and we're glad to be visiting Robert as well, and my wife Kelly is with me as well. Many people, if you watch the news, have said, oh, gosh, it's so uncivil. There's such incivility in Washington, and people are at each other's throats, and it's just terrible and rotten, there's no conversation. I would say it's not really accurate, actually. You know, having been there a couple years, I think actually relations are pretty good between Republicans and Democrats. The conversations are much better than you'd expect. I have a couple dozen friends who are Democrats that I've done bills with and work together on a daily basis. That doesn't mean there aren't differences of opinions. I mean, we really don't agree on a lot of stuff. We have great divisions. But really, as far as civility, it may be better than it has been at some times in our history. If any of you remember back to Adams and Jefferson, they were at each other's throats. You remember Jefferson, Adams, in those days you would kind of own your own newspaper. You'd sort of purchase, it'd be your party newspaper, and you'd go back and forth. And you remember Adams would go after Jefferson, and Jefferson would say, oh, that's fake news. They say, oh, well, Jefferson had a child out of wedlock with one of his slaves, and he said, oh, it's fake news. Well, maybe it wasn't so much fake news. But the thing is they were at each other's throats. Henry Clay from my state was senator from like 1810 to 1850. Before he was senator, he was actually in Congress for a term or two. I actually sit at his desk. The desks of certain senators are passed down to senators within the state. So my desk is the actual desk that Henry Clay sat at in 1810. But before he was in the Senate, he was in the House. And he's the only one who was elected one term in the House who actually became Speaker of the House in his first term. Most times people have been there 20, 30, 40 years, they become Speaker of the House. He was elected Speaker of the House in his first term. And it was kind of a raucous time. There were people on the floor. There was one guy, John Randolph of Roanoke, who was on the floor, and he had 2 dogs that he brought with him on the floor. Don't think Labradoodles, okay? Think the hounds from Game of Thrones, all right? So he has these hounds that he brings in, these big dogs, And he sits with them on the floor. And the guy from North Carolina came up to him and says, "You ought to get rid of those damn dogs. We don't need those dogs on the floor." And so he beat him over the head with his cane. There was the famous caning episode, where a congressman from South Carolina canes, the congressman from Massachusetts, the abolitionist. So there was violence. So at one point in time, Henry Clay gets elected to be the speaker, first term in office, and he says, "We're going to get rid of those damn dogs." And so he says to the Speaker of the House, or no, not to the Speaker of the House, to the Sergeant at Arms, who's actually armed and still is to this day, he says, "Tell them to get rid of the dogs." So they get rid of the dogs, and John Randolph of Roanoke, who he later fought a duel with, and actually Henry Clay became famous for fighting a duel to become senator. He had fought a duel in Kentucky before he got up there. John Randolph of Roanoke wasn't too happy about having his dogs removed, so he bows up his chest and he walks through the doors, the same doors we walk through, and he's out there and he's waiting for Henry Clay. Henry Clay finishes up his duties, and here comes John Randolph of Roanoke, and he says to him, and he points his finger at him, and he says, "You know what? I never sidestep a skunk." And Henry Clay breezed on past him and said, "You know what? I always do." So the moral of the story is there was no perfect halcyon days when everybody got along, when everybody agreed. There has been incivility. And it's not a justification for incivility. I think things did get out of hand with the Kavanaugh hearings, and there were a lot of screaming and yelling in your face. And if you want to get your point across, it doesn't help. It really isn't helpful to your position. You can disagree with people. Have an intelligent debate. Try to convince people of your position, but yelling and screaming doesn't get us anywhere. But one of the things I've thought about with Henry Clay is so lauded and loved, and what's he remembered as? The great compromiser. And so many people are often saying, well, you guys could be more civil, more could get done, you could work together if you would just compromise. But I think it's worth sort of thinking about that and examining that a little bit deeper when you think about compromise. What did Henry Clay compromise over? And are you still willing to compromise over these things? Henry Clay compromised and allowed that the U.S. would be half free and half slave. Raise your hand if you still think that's a good compromise. Obviously we don't. And people say, well, he was just a man of his times and compromise was important to keep the Union together. Well, there are people of his time who thought really compromising over slavery wasn't a good idea. And we ended up having a war anyway. And the question is, are there things you should stand up? Should you, think of things like slavery? Should there have been people who actually stood up and said it wasn't something worth compromising on? So in his compromises, he compromises over half free, half slave. He still allows the Fugitive Slave Act to occur. And he also still allows the DC slave trade to continue, which was under federal dominion. And you ask yourself, well, really, is that the kind of compromise we want? So you say, well, everybody should compromise. If you guys would just compromise with the other side, everything would be perfect up there. So I would propose to you that there are a couple types of compromise. One compromise is that you split the difference. Your opposition wants this, you want this, and you just take the middle. And so you have to accept some things that you don't think are good for the country, and you just split the difference. But I would offer to you that there's another form of compromise. And this is the kind of compromise that I think can lead to civility and maybe the country moving along in a direction. And this is a compromise where you do not strictly define yourself or position yourself that everything's about your party, or everything's about partisanship, that you don't have to be just about your party. And I think a good example of that is actually being a libertarian or a libertarian Republican. So I have many friends on the other side of the aisle. In fact, there are many issues for which the left and I are in perfect agreement. On the issue of war, I think we've been at war too long in too many places. I think we shouldn't go to war without a vote of the Congress. That's what the Constitution says. I'm for ending the war in Afghanistan. I'm for ending the war in Yemen. I'm for ending the war in Syria. I'm for ending the war in Africa. We're involved in 7 different wars. So I'm about as anti-war as you can get. You could say, well, that's a really progressive or left-leaning position, or it's a libertarian position, but it allows me to work with someone like Jeff Merkley from Oregon to say to the president, enough's enough, we should come home from Afghanistan. One of the things we've said, and one of the things that I think bears repeating if you look and study the issue, I mean, look, we've been there since before many of you were born, 17 some odd years, almost 18 years in Afghanistan. And the question is, what's our mission? So I ask everybody that. I asked Pompeo that during his hearing. I've asked Mattis that. I've asked everybody, what is the military position? What is the military solution to Afghanistan? You know what every one of them say? Republican, Democrat, or Independent, they say there is no military solution. Actually, ask them the same about Yemen. Is there a military solution to Yemen? No. Is there a military solution to Syria? No. In fact, the military solution is Assad won the war, frankly. Assad and Russia won the war. But there really isn't a military solution to most of these things. And that means maybe we have to look at trying another way. But these are issues where I've been able to work with the left. Privacy, whether or not the government should be able to either listen to your phone calls or record who you talk to or how long you talk to someone. I've worked with Patrick Leahy on that. I've worked with Ron Wyden on that, two progressive Democrats. Because the thing is that privacy, I think, doesn't have to be a Republican or a Democrat issue. And actually being a libertarian brings, I think, right and left together on many issues like this. On privacy, one of the biggest things that happened, and it's been a little while now, it's been the deal with Edward Snowden. How many people remember who Edward Snowden was? All right, very good. So Edward Snowden revealed something, and there's a question, whether you think he's a hero. Let's have another poll. Everybody's heard of Edward Snowden. All right, how many people think he was a hero, and hero, traitor? All right. So and then there was the big undecided there as well. But here's my point: is that I don't think we want to encourage a situation where everybody who works for government and secrets can just reveal their secrets. That's not a good idea. And yet, do you want a government that flagrantly disobeys the Constitution and lies to you? So Ron Wyden's my good friend from Oregon. He's on the Intelligence Committee, so he knows more than many of the other members do. Sitting before him is James Clapper, and he says, are you now or have you ever been recording and the time, duration, and the metadata on people's phone calls? And he said no, they weren't doing it. And it was an out-and-out lie, which is a felony to lie to Congress. Clapper knew he was lying and then came back later on and sort of said, oh, well, I misunderstood the question or something. He lied to us. And so when Edward Snowden reveals what he revealed, it was a direct whistleblowing event talking about what Clapper had lied and that something big was happening. How big was it? Well, James Otis and our founding fathers worked very hard to get the Fourth Amendment into the Bill of Rights. In fact, John Adams said it was a spark that led to the Revolution. James Otis in the 1760s sued over the idea of whether or not you could have a generalized warrant. A generalized warrant is, we say, well, everybody at Duke University, I want to, there's been some kind of crime committed, and I want to look at all of your phone calls. I want to listen to every conversation. I want to look at every email. That would be a generalized warrant. A specific warrant would be there's an accusation of a crime on campus, and the person was 5'10" of this and that, and we've described him, and it looks like it's you. You go to a judge, and you get a specific warrant. That's what the Fourth Amendment requires. What the government did, what Edward Snowden revealed, is they took one warrant and they went to Verizon. And they said to Verizon and presumably the other companies, but this is what Edward Snowden revealed. He revealed that they went to Verizon and said, give us all the data on everybody has a Verizon phone. So I actually sued over it because I had a Verizon phone. I didn't get very far in court, but that's a real question. Should you allow one warrant to apply to everyone? There's a legal doctrine that goes into this, and this is something that I think Gorsuch is going to be very good, and it's why I've had some doubts on Kavanaugh. The legal doctrine is one of third party. According to the Supreme Court in the 1970s, in a couple of cases, U.S. versus Miller and Maryland, Smith versus Maryland, they said that third party records have no Fourth Amendment protection. You say to yourself, what does that mean? The Fourth Amendment doesn't apply to anything when I deal with someone? So every one of you have a cell phone. All of your data goes to the cell phone company, who you talk to and how long you talk. And you say, well, the government says the Fourth Amendment doesn't apply to it all. What about your Visa card? This means that every purchase you make on a credit card could be subject. Do you think the government or your neighbor really has the right to know what you purchase with your Visa card and where you go and where you are all the time? So we finally had a court case recently on this, the Carpenter Case, and Gorsuch, I think, was the most libertarian on this, but even the majority of the court finally said, well, really, you really haven't given consent to the government to have all that GPS information. You now have GPS information. They can tell where you've been almost every second of your life through GPS location because your phone pings a new tower, so they can tell where you've been. And you say, well, it's not that personal, it's just metadata. Well, two students at Stanford put an app on phone of 400 volunteers, their friends, just to look and see what you could tell from metadata. 80% of the time they could tell someone's religion. 100% of the time they could tell who your doctors were and could insinuate or infer what your medical problems were. They even had one girl who got on the phone, talked to her sister for 30 minutes, and then made a call to Planned Parenthood. You think you might infer what she might be making a phone call about. So the thing is should the government have that knowledge? Should the government be able to look at that? Absolutely not. And I think these are things that, people on the right can say we can work together with people on the left and try, but it's not really splitting the difference. It's not me saying, well, we should let them spy on us half the time and maybe have some limitations on it. That's what almost always happens in Washington. And when you hear people saying compromise, 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 almost always they're saying split the difference. Maybe we could work together with the other side when we agree with them on things and actually be absolutely for what we're for. With Ron Wyden, and I work with him all the time, he's a progressive Democrat. We don't agree on taxes, we don't agree on regulations, we don't agree on spending, we don't agree on a lot. But we also don't spend a lot of time talking about the things we disagree on. And it's sort of something I would suggest even when you're going out with your friends and talking to people, when you meet somebody, for libertarians, it's great. If you're a far on the left, we can talk to you about war and privacy and drug policy. And we won't talk about taxes, guns, or balanced budgets. And so the thing is there are ways that we can come together, but I don't really like the idea of splitting the differences. Are there things that I would split the difference on? Yeah, probably some spending numbers. If you're willing to reform Social Security. So for example, Social Security is completely broken. We spend more than comes in. All right, Social Security has a $7 trillion obligation. It won't be there for you. I promise it won't be there for you. You're all living longer, we're living longer. You have to raise the age of eligibility. Nobody wants to do it because it's unpopular to tell people they're going to have to wait longer, but you have to do it. But would I compromise? I think you should go to 70 just because you have to. But if you say, well, I'll only go to 68, now, would I split the difference and say 69? Sure, there are things that you can split the difference on. But if you ask me whether or not you should get a trial by jury, should I split the difference and say, well, if you're an enemy combatant, really no. And that's what we've done. We had this debate, we've had it going on for 7 years now on whether or not an American citizen can be indefinitely detained without a trial and even sent to Guantanamo Bay. Had this debate with John McCain on the floor. We're going back and forth, and I say, does that mean you would send an American citizen to Guantanamo Bay without a trial? And he said, yes, if they're dangerous. And I said, well, who would decide? Well, Congress or whoever accuses them of a crime. Well, does anybody see a problem with that? Does anybody remember the 1920s and 30s and what we did to African Americans in our country where you were accused of a crime and strung up at the edge of town? The thing is we do still need to be worried. I think less about race than we once did, but you still have to be worried about giving the government the power to make the decision that you're an enemy combatant and that you don't get a trial. I'm not willing to compromise on that. I think without question, you should always get a trial by jury. There should always be this presumption of innocence. And I don't know, I think it is good that we have spirited debates over that. But that's something that John McCain and Lindsey Graham and I went round and round and still go round and round because they think the idea that you could be accused of an enemy combatant, you're now in a different category. And that there's this worldwide war of terrorism against us. Well, sure there is, but if the government gets to decide who's a terrorist, you got to be really careful that if you have an unpopular opinion, if you have an lifestyle that the majority of people don't like, or a religion that some people don't like, that maybe you could be lumped into that. And you say, well, I'm not Muslim, I don't have to worry about it, or I'm not Arab, I don't have to worry about it. Remember what Niemöller said about when the Nazis came. I didn't complain at first because I wasn't a socialist. I didn't complain because I wasn't Jewish. But in the end, it came for me and there was no one there. And that's why I think we have to be very, very careful about giving up these protections. Most of them are done out of fear. And most of them are done, frankly, unfortunately, the Republicans have been much worse on this than the Democrats. But these are some issues I've been able to work with the Democrats on. As far as working with the Republicans, I've worked with Republicans because I think government should be small. I think the smaller the government, the more freedom you have. The more of your paycheck you have, the more freedom you have. So I'm for a very, very small government. I sometimes jokingly say, so small you can barely see it. And because I want to be left alone. And I think that can bring right and left together. It doesn't seem to bring too many people from the left together on this. But I'm surprised because some on the left say they want to be left alone. The government shouldn't listen to their phone calls, shouldn't intrude on their privacy. And yet, well, why should the government intrude on your paycheck? And why should the government have dominion over your small business? And so I think these are things that are consistent from the libertarian point of view, but it's sort of, on the economic side of the coin, I'm with the Republicans. On the foreign policy, drug policy things, I'm with the Democrats. There are a lot of things that we do, particularly in criminal justice, that we ought to be aware of and how unfair they are. If you ask people by survey and you try to figure out how many people have ever used illegal drugs, it's about the same between blacks and whites. Blacks are about 13% of the population, but they're about half of the prison population. And this is almost all just talking about drug policy. How did it get to be that way? Well, there is a racial disparity in drug policy, and there shouldn't be, and we should do something about it. There's a racial disparity at every step through the legal system. When you're arrested, when you get bail, what your penalty is, you name it, all the way through. I think most of it's related to economic situation and where you live as opposed to out-and-out racism, although there may be some racism. But I'll tell you a story that should make you concerned about the legal system for people who don't have. You will all have the resources. Your kids will have resources. You'll be able to protect your children. You can be protected probably from your parents, but there are people who can't. And I'll tell you a story briefly of one who wasn't. His name was Kalief Browder. And he was arrested and accused of stealing a knapsack from somebody. It was a petty crime. But he had a prior for a joyride in a car, stole a car. So I'm not saying he's a perfect angel. Accused of stealing a backpack. His bail was set at $3,000. He didn't have it, so he went to Rikers Island. He spent 3 years at Rikers Island. 3 years without a trial. Just rotting in prison. He was beaten by guards, beaten by gangs. Who knows what happened to him, which is a whole nother story. There shouldn't be anybody in prison in the United States that is raped in prison or abused in prison. How we can let that happen is unconscionable. But he spent 3 years in there. He tried to commit suicide several times in prison, finally got out, and was so screwed up that he finally did commit suicide. He never was convicted of anything, never even got a trial. The Sixth Amendment says you're supposed to get a speedy trial. He got no trial. So I've worked with people on the left. I worked with Kamala Harris to say we should fix this. And bail should be proportional to the crime and also the possibility of the person paying. And these are things we can fix. There's a lot that we've done wrong in the criminal justice system. We have people serving life sentences for possession of drugs. We actually convict and take people's money just by convicting their money. There was a story of a young man who was given $1,000 by his dad, and he was going to drive out to LA and start his career. He gets stopped by a small town policeman in Nevada, and they said, "Do you have any money?" He says, "Well, my dad gave me $1,000. He said, "Give it to me." He said, "Why?" "Well, you now need to prove that you didn't get that money through drugs." So, "Well, my dad gave it to me, and why should the presumption of me being guilty and then I have to prove to you that it's my money?" They take the money. It's called civil asset forfeiture. It doesn't require a conviction. You actually have to sue the police to get your money back. How could that possibly be right in our system? This is another thing we've worked on between right and left. And then when you say, well, you just need to compromise, you don't need to compromise. Here's what I'm going to tell you, and it's not politically correct, and some of you may not at first believe it. One of our biggest problems in Washington is actually too much compromise. And when I say that on television, they go crazy. Too much compromise is a problem. I'll tell you where the compromise is. It's on spending. The right wants spending for military, the left wants spending for welfare. So what happens? You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. All spending goes up. So spending's going up at alarming proportions. I ran for office because I said, President Obama and those damn Democrats are spending too much money. Guess what? Republicans are doing the same thing. So Republicans control all three branches of government, and spending is going up at alarming levels. The deficit this year will be $1.2 trillion. It's $22 trillion. I have a clock in my office, a debt clock, just spinning wildly out of control. And you say, well, it's no big deal. We'll just print up more money. Well, you know, ask what happens in Venezuela when you print up too much money. I think they had 24,000% inflation last year. So you can only live so long on other people's money till it runs out, or you have to do something. So I think there is compromise, but really we're compromising on spending. And so I've been a loud voice against my own party saying we're spending too much. We've got to do something. I'll finish with this and then we'll have a few questions. There have been angry people out there yelling, and one of the things they yell is, do your job, and people are up in your face and really angry about this do your job. I think it's a reasonable question, not one to yell or scream, but in order to ask the question, do your job, whether your legislators doing your job, you've got to understand and have a discussion over what our job is. So if you think that my job is to get you something of material worth, to get you something that was someone else's, if your neighbor's got 3 cars and you don't have a car and you want me to bring a car, we just have a disconnect because I don't think that's the job of government. So I think the job of government is much more fundamental. I think the job of government is to protect your liberty. I personally think it's God-given liberty, but even if you don't believe in God, liberty is somehow naturally, it's yours. It's your right not to be aggressive. The libertarians call it the non-aggression principle. Christians call it the golden rule, act only the way you would wish to be treated. The Indian culture had it from, time immemorial, the same kind of concept. And it's this idea that there should be a universality to the way people are treated, and that's the job of government. Kant called it the categorical imperative. He said, act only on that maxim which can be universally applied. So if you're for violence, you'd have to be for violence against yourself. So it would have to be a government that doesn't commit violence. And a government really of that concept is one that protects your liberties. If you look at the Bill of Rights, most of them are telling Congress what they can't do, what government can't do to the individual. It's about the individual versus the government. Sometimes we think that, and I think we're sometimes taught this, that the American Revolution was this abrupt change, when the American Revolution was just something wild and different and novel. It kind of was, but it really actually fits more neatly in the tradition of the English rebelling against central power, beginning with the Magna Carta on. Just 100 years before our revolution, 80 years before our revolution, they had their revolution, they had their Bill of Rights. It's always been about the individual versus the central power. It's been about limitations. It's been about having these limitations codified in a document, first the Magna Carta, then the English Constitution, then the American Constitution. It's been about some kind of restraint, and it's been about government not taking away your liberty. So if you think that government's job is to take from one individual and give to another, that's just a different concept of what you think the job is. I think the government's job is to protect your liberty. And I'll finish with this. I think that there is a strong argument for why you should keep government small. Thomas Paine said that government is a necessary evil. What he meant by that is we got to have some government. There are some basic functions that we want. We want them to protect contracts. We want them to keep safety, both external and internal. We agree that there's going to be some government, but we wouldn't want too much. And the best way to look at it is this. If your taxes were 100%, you'd have no liberty to spend the fruits of your labor. If it were 50%, you'd be a little bit freer. Which would you rather be, 50% taxes or 10% taxes? So it's really the idea of how much of your freedom, of your labor, what you earned, you want to give up. So the argument should be the least I can possibly give up and have a government. Now, there would be a debate over what that number actually is, but there is an argument that we should minimize the size of government to maximize how much of your liberty you get to keep. The other argument for keeping government small is what Milton Friedman said. He said that nobody, I call this the efficiency argument, he said that nobody spends somebody else's money as wisely as their own. Think about it. Why is government always inept? Why are they always messing stuff up? Why does the post office lose $1 billion a quarter? Because they don't get the same feedback signal. It's not their money. So they're willing to spend money, and they're not willing to judiciously look at it the same way. If I ask you for $1,000, you'd say, well, I had to work X amount of hours. I had to do all this work to get $1,000. Government's not their money, so they're inherently not very good at things and not very good at really making wise decisions. So we should only let the government do things that we can't do. National defense, a few other things, almost nothing else. We shouldn't have them in the cable business. You say, well, we need broadband for rural America. No, we don't need the government involved in that. Private enterprise will take care of this. And the thing is that once we say it's the government's job, you're acknowledging you're going to have this enormous government with this enormous debt that we're passing on to. When I think about what our job is and doing your job, I think of what Goldwater wrote in The Conscience of the Conservative. He said, if I am accused of neglecting my constituents' interests, I will remind them that I was told their chief interest was liberty. And in that cause, I will continue to do the best that I can. That's the way I see your government. I think doing our job is trying to protect your liberty. I think there is room for right and left to come together. But I don't think it always means splitting the difference or accepting the lesser of two evils. I think that there needs to be and should be a place for people who actually do have convictions, who do believe in something, and who would say, and this is still the debate of history, was the compromises that Henry Clay made, did they prevent the Civil War or stave it off? Or in the end, were they really compromises over something you shouldn't compromise, and that's owning another human? I think there are things you shouldn't compromise over, and I think we should try to work together, and I think there's a possibility for that. But I think we should be we should really self-examine exactly what we want from government, what we think the job of government is. Thank you very much. And we'll be happy to do some questions. Easy questions only. If they're hard, Professor Salzman's going to have to answer them. Yes, go ahead. You choose. Just pass it around.
Can I just stand and talk? Use the microphone.
I'd use the microphone. I think it's easier for everybody to hear.
Great, thanks. So I was just curious how you would create your version of a small government that still is able to reconcile some of the sort of economic inequalities that we have, and historically in the U.S., where we're not sort of all on the same playing field. How you would create a government
Right.
that still is able to address those issues.
I think there is no world in which there is no inequality, and it would be a world that would be so tightly controlled that you really wouldn't want to live in it. But even in the socialist world, where everything's supposed to be about equality, some pigs are more equal than others. I mean, in Venezuela, Maduro grows fat, and the average person's lost like 20 pounds. So really, if you say, well, we have to sort of do something about redressing inequality, you can let the government do it. And so the people who get better equality and get more stuff and get more food and get to wait, they're first in line for health care and first in line for food, will be people who are in the party and who know somebody. Or you could have what we have, which isn't perfect, but is relatively a meritocracy. I mean, our country, one of the amazing things, Barbara Tuchman writes about this when she writes about our revolution. She says that for the first time, people were rewarded not by who they were, nobility of birth. That obviously wasn't perfect. We had a race problem, and women were not allowed to vote either. So there were problems we overcame over time. But I think you're living in a country where, one, there's been an extraordinary amount of wealth created in this country, and the distribution of it is mostly based on merit. Sure, some people inherit wealth, but the thing is if you say to yourself, well, no, I'd much rather live where it's redistributed, the examples of extraordinary equality, the Soviet Union, Cambodia, North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, really some are more equal than others. And so I guess I would much rather be judged, if I'm a good physician, more people come to me and I become more successful and make more money. If I'm a bad physician, not as many people. Same with welding, same with carpentry, same with everything else. And it doesn't mean it's going to be perfect. The other thing about income inequality, if you look at it, 50% of the people who made $1 million last year won't make $1 million this year. If you look at the Fortune 500 of people, it goes up and down. If you look at people born in the bottom 20%, the vast majority move up 1 or 2 quintiles. So really there's much more mobility than you would think in our country. But the main thing is this: if you want a system based on equality, realize that there is virtually no example of a system based on equality that is economically prosperous. I'll give you one more statistic on how successful we are and what a great place this is, what a great country it is, and a great world. In 1800, 85% of people lived in extreme poverty. It's defined as less than $2 a day. Using constant dollars, by the time I was married in 1990, it had gone from 85% of extreme poverty to 30%. Right now, only 28 years later, 9% of the people live in extreme poverty. This is worldwide. This is counting all the worst places in the world as far as poverty goes. Only 9% of the world lives in extreme poverty. What is that from? And this is a decision all you have to make, whether you're voters or what you do. Is it from because we've embraced socialism or capitalism? I think for the most part, it's trade and capitalism and freedom. And we have to realize how desperately people want this around the world. You remember the young man who burned himself to begin the Arab Spring? I think it was Bouzazi was his name in Tunisia. He didn't burn himself because he was of some kind of radical religious beliefs. He sold vegetables in the marketplace, and he wanted to buy a truck and become a truck farmer to truck it from the farm to the, and he couldn't get a license. It was really his complaint about oppressive government. But I don't know. I think just the people who want and think government should be big about figuring out inequality have to realize that most of the time it comes with force. Because if I've got more money than you, I'm not going to give it to you. You're going to have to come and get it. So you have to send people with guns. People say, "Oh, that doesn't happen." Well, if I don't give it to you right now, and let's say my taxes are 10 times your taxes, if I don't give it, the police will come to my house and put me in jail. So we already use the threat of force for this. I don't think we should be doing that. I think government should be way smaller and taxes a lot smaller, and they shouldn't be in the redistribution business to mete out equality.
Thank you for being here, Senator Paul. You opened your comments by testifying to the civility that you see on Capitol Hill, but I think we've all encountered political discourse more broadly that it's definitely not civil and is potentially less civil than it's ever been. Many people, myself included, see a link between language office holders have used and rising violence against minority communities and religious minority communities. Can you comment on that and how office holders can be responsible about the language they use?
Yeah, I think I'm not saying there's no incivility. I guess I was trying to put it in perspective. And so we do have incivility, and I think language does incite it. And I have been concerned about it on both sides of the aisle, and have spoken out about it on both sides of the aisle. I think that, recently with the Kavanaugh hearing, it seemed to be coming from the left, but I think the right has had their share of language that's been insightful as well, inciting of violence as well. I think that we have to remember that there are people among us who are unstable and have anger issues. I was at the ball field when the guy came to shoot at us and Steve Scalise was almost killed. A guy about 10 feet from me was shot in the outfield when I was in the batting cage. And the guy who did it was a guy who had a long history. I think he had hit his neighbor with the butt of his gun. He'd been arrested at city council for yelling and screaming. He was a guy with anger issues. So there are people out there, and some of them get destabilized by language. Some of them are simply just mentally ill too, schizophrenics, but schizophrenics who may have a violent tendency as well. So yeah, I think we should ratchet the language down. I've always been one who says that, for example, with regard to who you are, race, color, skin, where you came from, that one of the great things about America is us being a melting pot of people who came from everywhere, and that and this is something I break with the president on in saying that I think immigrants in general are assets to our country and bring great things to our country and are really actually needed right now. We're doing so well economically, we need more people for jobs actually. And so I think we can all do better on it, and I try not to be part of that. So I don't want to downplay it such to say that there's no problem. But I think that we all need to realize that you're going to get farther with, honey than vinegar, that the yelling and screaming on both sides is not doing any good. I mean, it's gotten to the point where I have to ride in a car from my office to go vote. It's 200 yards. Because during the Kavanaugh hearing, I had people in my face with cameras yelling, "Rape, rape, you like rapists. Do you want to put children in cages?" Like, no. But the thing is why who thinks that that's somehow productive to our society to yell and scream stuff like that? And that's kind of where we've gotten. So I think we can all do better, but both sides.
Thank you for your time and thank you for being with us. You emphasized the role of government in protecting people's individual liberties. What are some practical ways that we could reform our criminal justice system?
That's a good question. I don't think we should put people in jail for most drug use. I think drug use is more of a health problem than it is, and I'm not advocating for it. I think there are people who are ruining their possibilities with drugs. We have people overdosing, even pot. I think people who smoke pot every day probably are not going to reach their potential, so I'm not an advocate, but I am an advocate for freedom, and I think putting people in jail for it, one, has led to a racial disparity in who gets imprisoned. Many more African Americans, people of color, are in jail because they tend to be, I always look at it this way. If you're a white kid and you live in the suburbs and you have a $500,000 house and you're smoking pot in the basement, the police are never getting there. But if you live downtown and you're out by a barrel that's burning flames out of a barrel and you're smoking pot or crack or something, you're going to get caught. And so it's just over and over. It's not all racism, but it's a matter of being wrong place, which is where there's more crime and more poverty. But I would say that we should have less incarceration, a lot less. So and some of these things I think should be decriminalized, period. As far as what we do, Kelly's worked with a lot of things with criminal justice. Like we do insane things. Women are shackled while giving birth in prison. often just women that are there for drug dealing or using drugs. That's ridiculous. There are things that women are denied, basic health and hygiene products in prison that women are denied. Those are things that we could fix. We should give judges more discretion on deciding sentences. We have this like 3 strikes and you're out. Sometimes you get 3 strikes in one time. Sometimes if it's a police informant selling you drugs and they do it within 1,000 feet of the school, now you've upped the charges by tenfold. If you're a convicted felon, you're not supposed to have a gun. I'm fine with that. But they've put a convicted felon who they found 3 shotgun shells that were loaded shells back in prison for having a weapon because it had 3 shells. And so there are a lot of things I think we could do with criminal justice, but that's where I'd start.
Hi, Senator. So I wanted to get your thoughts on the idea of making arguments for a policy while dropping the ideological basis for that policy. And you mentioned this yourself, the legalization of marijuana, for example, has made headway in the country, a much more divisive one, but the deregulation of telecom has made headway in the country.
The deactivation of what?
The deregulation of telecom.
Okay.
So these arguments for these policies weren't necessarily made from an ideological standpoint, but rather a more holistic one. And another event that I like to point out would be the Niskanen Center in Washington, D.C., which was formerly a libertarian think tank, has decided to drop the libertarian moniker on October 29th because they realized that it was leading to more divisiveness and not being able to implement those policies in the first place.
No, I think it's a reasonable question, and I think there are times when arguing that facts are important, facts and evidence are important, and we can make an argument on that. I don't think it's always that way. So, for example, I think the passion of believing that no one should be incarcerated without a jury trial is something I don't really care what the statistics say. You know what I mean? That it's something so basic. You know, the idea of the 19th century of slavery is so basic. Well, the South was more productive and they could do much more, and people had more wealth because they had slaves. You see what I mean? There are times I think when liberty trumps the practicality of the argument means nothing. But I would say, for example, like with the Afghan war, I'm always talking about practical arguments for why we shouldn't be there any longer. We're spending $50 billion a year. There's a practical, pragmatic argument that that's money wasted. And I can go through a list of dozens and dozens of things we waste money on there. $90 million for a half-built hotel, $45 million for a gas station. We can't even see the gas station because it's in a part of Afghanistan so dangerous we can't get to. So there are practical arguments. And I think if there are times when you can put the ideological argument on a back burner, so if you and I disagree on a basic assumption that maybe we could have a more civil discussion on the facts of things. So I think you do have a point there. I would just say that I don't think it's an all or none, basically, that you throw out completely ideology, because ideology kind of informs us as well. If for example, you start with a presumption that you really don't care about individual liberty and you care only about the collective and the individual should always submit to the collective, we will have a lot of ramifications from that. In the practical argument, we may not get anywhere. But there are a lot of things that aren't completely one or the other, and some of these things are very technical. Patent reform. Yes, we don't have, we can try to figure out patent reform, which is very complicated based on the actual facts. And even in the end, I still have trouble understanding patent reform. But
thank you for your time, Senator Paul. With the rise of deadly mass shootings, how do you reconcile your stance on the lack of comprehensive gun control with your constituents' right and liberty to live a safe life and maintain their right to life?
Right. Well, I think that all of us, no matter which side you come from, are horrified, by what's going on. If tomorrow we could ban all handguns and semi-automatic rifles, if we just banned them, that would be more than anybody's really even asking for. But let's say we could. I guess the question is, what do you think would happen? I mean, do you think we'd have less violence? We have like 3 million guns, so they're still going to be there. A lot of guns that are committed, like the shooting yesterday, he had registered the handgun, but then he California's made the clip illegal, but he had one. And you can make them, you can buy them, they're legal in other states. And so I think it's very hard to do this, but it's also terrible just to throw up our hands and say, oh, well, we'll do nothing. I think with the example in Florida, I think we ought to look at what could have actually stopped it. Background checks and all the things like that we do some of that already, but wouldn't have and didn't stop the Florida thing. None of the proposed reforms would have stopped it. But the local sheriff doing his job would have stopped it. The local school system doing its job. It's sad. Every kid in that school, while the shots were still ringing through the halls, was going, I guarantee it's so-and-so. They all knew the crazy what, and they knew it was him. So everybody knew he was crazy. He'd been involved all these times. He was shooting up the neighbor's chickens or something. If you're recklessly discharging a gun, that should be a felony. He should have gone to jail for shooting up a neighbor's chickens. You say, well, that's not that bad. No, that was a warning sign to all the rest of us. He should have been arrested. Once he was arrested, he should not be allowed to own guns. We should enforce that. Of the people who are felons, there's like tens of thousands of them. I think we prosecuted 3 of them last year for having a firearm. I think if you've been convicted of a felony, you shouldn't be in a house with guns. So if this kid was convicted of a felony and his parents had guns, I think they should have been told the kid has to move out or the guns have to move out. So there are things that I am for, but I'm not for simply taking away people's guns, because the 99% of the people are not killing people. The vast majority are peace-loving people. It's how do we figure out who's violent among us and stop them before they commit these crimes. And a lot of times there have been warning signals. The guy that shot up the dance club in Orlando, he went into a gun store 6 weeks in advance and said, I want to buy 2,000 rounds of ammunition and Kevlar, and they didn't sell armor. And then he got on the phone and he was speaking in Arabic, and the gun store owner was suspicious of him, called the FBI. The FBI came out there, didn't look at the surveillance footage because they would have seen he was a guy that they'd been investigating. So, we've got to do better police work. One of the interesting things about most of the terrorist shootings in our country, almost every one of them have been investigated by the FBI in advance. And the FBI has then said, oh, we don't have enough evidence. And I understand having to have evidence to have a conviction, but I think the investigation should go on. If you started the investigation and you're still suspicious, maybe we should, and that's what I told the FBI, maybe these investigations should continue. Then there's the larger question, why do we have this violence? Have we always had it and we just know about it because everything's on television now, or do we have more of it? I tend to think we do have more of it, and then it gets to a bigger question of sort of morals of right and wrong, of how people know something's right and wrong. Do video games encourage it? Well, everybody in here probably plays video games, and I'm hoping none of you are mass murderers. I don't think we ban video games either, but I think some people are obsessed by them, and I think there are mentally unstable people who play them 8 hours a day who are also mentally unstable, that it probably doesn't help their condition. But, even banning the guns won't stop it, and I think that you do it. It's just sort of like the war against terrorism. We have to decide. So, for example, we think we can get more terrorists if we listen to all your phone calls. Are you willing to give up listening to all your phone calls in order to be safer? It's the same with guns as well. Could we maybe stop some of it if we picked up and confiscated all the guns and had a buyback program, and for the next 10 years we bought back every gun? One, that won't happen in America. We're not really open to that. But let's see, even if you did that, I'm not so sure that. That's a trade-off. You're trading security for freedom. So maybe 1 or 2 more.
Thank you for your time, Senator Paul. My question is about the next 2 years with the Republicans losing the House but maintaining the Senate. What do you think the next 2 years are going to look like for Republicans? Do you think the Democrats are going to push for impeachment? Do you think they're going to keep their cards close to the chest? What do you think it's going to look like?
I think very little will happen. I think the Democrats will put forward their initiatives in the House, and I think they will die in the Senate. And so I don't think very little legislation is going to move forward. The good news from the economic perspective is, one, for the first time in decades, we repealed a bunch of regulations right at the outset of the Trump administration, and we had a significant tax cut. This tax cut is fueling the best economy in my lifetime. I meet people out there every day who say there's never been a better time to be in business. The number one complaint in Kentucky, and as I travel and meet business managers, is lack of people to work. Well, it's a lack of workers. So it's a great time. In the next 2 years, the Democrats will not be able to pass any new regulations or taxes. So it's going to be stymied. You won't have new legislation, but nothing really bad's going to happen. The other good thing that happens, this is obviously from a Republican point of view, is that the people who run the regulatory agencies are people who I think better balance the economy and the regulatory role. I think the other side had tipped more towards the Elizabeth Warren side, which is regulation, regulation, if it moves, regulate it. And I think that had gone too far, and it was stymieing economic growth. And so now you have, I think, a much better chance of getting economic growth. So I don't think a lot happens legislatively, but my hope is that the economic growth cycle that we're in right now will continue. The only thing that could stop it is if we go too far on the tariff idea, and I think the tariffs could really stymie the economy.
Thank you very much. How do you think the Republican Party can win back a lot of suburban districts, like, for example, my district, the 11th in New Jersey with Rodney Frelinghuysen, especially when you see I think, a lot of large margins in terms of Democrat victories? What do you think they can do better?
I think being more libertarian actually probably would help them. So I think there are some issues that, are some libertarian, but maybe soften the image of Republicans only caring about money and balanced budgets and taxes that are other issues. Like I said, I've worked with Kirsten Gillibrand on sexual assault in the military. Right now you have to report it to your superior, who often is drinking buddies with the man who assaulted you. I've advocated with her that it go through the JAG or go through the legal aspect with your complaint, which seems very reasonable. Things like that, I think Republicans could come behind. Medical marijuana at the very least, not putting people in jail forever for drug crimes, nonviolent drug crimes, war. I think we could be better, and that look, even President Trump, said the Iraq War was a mistake, and he said it very loudly. And I think there are a lot of people that are in the middle that are economically conservative that might come Republican way but are put off by other issues or social issues. And so I think there are ways that being more libertarian might make it easier. I think rhetoric makes a difference. I think we were starting to struggle with suburban women, and I think the rhetoric that appears to be harsh towards immigrants has hurt us, and things like that. And so there's a whole group of people in the country who are much more concerned with the demeanor of the president and the language of the president than they are the policy. I frankly look only at the policy and ignore all of the other stuff. I don't read his Twitter account. I don't read any of that stuff. I'm basing it on the policy that I think economically our country is doing great and better because we have less government now. And those are some suggestions, but I think it's been a long process. It isn't just Donald Trump. New England's been losing its Republican base it had for 30 or 40 years. California has. I think California's down to maybe 4 Republican congressmen out of like 50 or something. I mean, I've told them out there they ought to adopt the Domino's strategy. Remember Domino's said our pizza crust sucks and we're sorry, but we're going to make it better? GOP should say our pizza crust sucks and we're going to change our name or do something. But 25% of the people in California identify as Republicans. Young people, even here, see, I think Yale may do better than college Republicans. I don't know that, but because I think they attract people, probably there are some people in Yale that come from the left and some that come from the right, frankly, because it's more of a libertarian group. But I think that may be some advice on it. Why don't we do one more and then we'll be done?
Thank you for coming. So you talk a lot about liberty in the context of people being able to control their bodies. And I appreciate if you could consider that in the lens of abortion, especially to the point of, don't you think women should be able to control their decisions up to the point of fetal viability?
Just when I thought I was going to get away with no hard questions.
And especially, I'd like you to remember that the President of the United States himself said that women should be punished for having an abortion.
Yeah. It is a good question, and it divides libertarians. And the best way to put it is this: libertarians believe in non-aggression. And so if you think that the baby inside the womb is not a person, then do whatever you want. And then it is a freedom issue. If you think it's a person, that you're injuring another individual, then the non-aggression principles, libertarians would say the government has a role in stopping you from hurting another individual. So really the whole debate over abortion, and I know we have a variety of issues, and I'm not going to probably convince people one way or another, you have to decide in your mind, when does life begin? And there are some people who say it's not until it's a sentient human. Well, there are adults who aren't. You know, that would I mean, seriously. And I don't mean that to be funny. I mean, there are people with mental illness who aren't capable of taking care of themselves and really can't think, speak, or anything maybe. We still don't say you can kill them. And, but it is difficult. I mean, the definition of sort of when quickening happens or vitality has changed with modern medicine over time. And you're just I can't. I'm not going to be able to convince you one way or another. But that's why the difference is. A libertarian like myself believes that the baby in the womb is a baby. It's a human. You can't commit aggression, and there is a role for the government. We can debate over what that role is and how you police abortion or whatever. But the country's almost evenly divided on that, and libertarians are probably evenly divided on that too. But I think that's the question you have to have. And then, see, some people have said, I think Nancy Pelosi said that, you know, you decide on the child's, and so did Watson of Watson and Crick fame. I think Watson said you'd decide after a year. You'd look at the kid and see how well he's doing, thriving, does he have any genetic diseases, and then you decide at the end of a year whether, you know, you can make your decision on whether to keep the child for a year. Some people say it's in the nursery. Some people say it's in the last trimester. But for those of us who say, well, inside it's just the property of the woman, it becomes pretty grisly if you think about a 7 or 8 pound baby in the 3rd trimester that baby doesn't have any protection. I'm not going to say, no, we're not going to convince each other on it, but that's why libertarians are divided on it. Thanks, everybody.
Yep. So thank you all for coming today. I know you all might have things to do, so just real quick again, thanks for coming out and sign up for Young Americans for Liberty, our listserv. We're a fun group. So thank you.